Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Children's Partnership's 30th anniversary event, the second in our For Our Children's Future speaker series. Thank you so much for joining this important conversation and for your partnership and support these past 30 years. My name is Mayra Alvarez, and I am the president of the Children's Partnership. A few announcements before we get started. A recording of this webinar will be shared after the event. If you have a question, please drop it in the Zoom Q&A box. There will be an audience Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. For closed captioning, click the live transcript button from the in-meeting Zoom toolbar and select one of the options from the menu. Also, before we get our virtual conversation started, I want to share that the Children's Partnership is inclusive of all people and perspectives, except for hate. We do not tolerate racist, transphobic, homophobic, xenophobic, misogynistic, or malicious comments, and will remove and report anyone who feels the need to disrupt the growth and peace of the space. Our objective is to hold a webinar where all people are safe and welcomed. Thank you again for being with us and in our community. As we get started, I want to take a moment to thank the champions with us today. Without their support, this event and the series would not be possible. In particular, the California Healthcare Foundation, Ultimate Health Services Corporation, HealthNet, and First 5 LA, alongside all our other generous sponsors. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to children's well-being. So let's get started. In 1993, the Children's Partnership was founded as a different type of children's organization, an organization that sought to set a children's agenda on emerging issues. The Children's Partnership at that time provided the first comprehensive look at how computers and the internet were changing the way children learn, grow, socialize, and find opportunity. Since that time, TCP has continued its leadership, centering children in the work to advance telehealth years before a global pandemic required this of all of us, placing a children's lens on issues of immigration and remaining in the fight for health for all, uplifting the need for intersectional advocacy to make progress for families, and consistently collaborating with partners to drive a shared agenda forward for children, especially those most marginalized. Today, such foresight and innovation define our approach and remain drivers in determining TCP priorities for where to make the most impact for children who have been historically underserved by our institutions and systems, specifically children of color in our state. We pride ourselves on collaborating with others to drive this shared agenda forward for children, again, especially those most marginalized. Our advocacy does three things. It acknowledges the role of racism in the past. It is unapologetic about the need to uplift community wisdom, and it is rooted in the power of partnership. All of this for our shared work to advance child health equity. When we considered how to celebrate these 30 years, we wanted to invite our community into a conversation about the work ahead. We deeply believe that a child is a child, and our work is to ensure that every child in our state of California and across the nation is treated and valued as such, and to ensure that our state and national policies support the ability for every child, regardless of background, to lead a healthy life and to have access to the resources they need to succeed. Most of us believe that children deserve the freedom to be themselves and to learn the truth of our past in order to understand our present and create a better future. However, across the country, a disturbing trend of policies and narratives is at work. From book bans to eroding child labor laws, to stripping the rights of trans children, to attempts to erase our history. These attacks on our children take many forms, but all are harming our children's safety, their mental health, their education, and hindering growth and opportunity for millions, particularly children from Black, Indigenous, Asian American, and Latinx families, children with mixed race backgrounds, children from immigrant communities, LGBTQ children, and of course, children who live in poverty. Many may refer to these as culture wars. but they are really questions that speak to the core of who we are as leaders, as parents, as community members, and most importantly, who we want to be. I still consider myself a relatively new mom, and I'll be the first to say that parenting has always been a complex task. But the polarized atmosphere in our country introduces unique challenges in the form of an erosion of trust and social cohesion that can impact our children's well-being and development. This speaker series is intended to elevate such challenges, identify solutions, and work together with you and our partners to do more for our children. And that conversation continues today. I am so excited to be joined by Melanie Fontes Rainer, the Director of the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Director Fontes Rainer leads the department's enforcement of federal civil rights and privacy laws and directs related policy and strategic initiatives. But we like to claim her as one of our own. Previously, she served as counselor to Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra, providing strategy guidance on civil rights, patient privacy, reproductive health, the Affordable Care Act, and more. And before joining the Biden-Harris administration, Director Fontes Rainer served as the special assistant to the Attorney General and Chief Healthcare Advisor at the Department of Justice in California, where she led a national team to save the Affordable Care Act. During this time, she also facilitated the creation of the Healthcare Rights and Access Office. She was devoted to proactively advancing laws pertaining to healthcare, civil rights, privacy, competition, and consumer protection, all the while being incredibly accessible to constituents of the state to answer questions, and more importantly, to be a champion for children and families and their well-being. Director Fontes Rainer, thank you for being with us. This afternoon, we're in a virtual room full of advocates in some way, shape, or form, whether professionally or personally. And we decided to title this conversation, A Child's Right to Thrive. So much of child health inequities today have their roots in systemic racism and historical discrimination that has, again, hindered opportunity for far too many. We've known throughout history and the impacts of systemic barriers. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there are growing concerns that every child is not provided that equal right to thrive. Through our own personal experiences, I know each of us bring a particular perspective to this work. So as we start this conversation, I want to ask you, in your role as director of the Office for Civil Rights, but also in your role as the daughter of a single mother, we want to hear your thoughts on what you consider the most crucial issues impacting the well-being of our children today. And also, as we consider the responsibility of each of us to raise healthy, thriving children in our communities, what comes up for you?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me and for that gracious introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining. Yeah, so I will just take it back a second. So yes, I was raised by a single parent. My mom is Mexican American. My dad wasn't really in the picture, and so I was really raised by my sister and my older sister, who's 10 years older than me, and my mom. And that meant when my sister went to college and I was still in middle school and high school, I did a lot of parenting myself, right? Cooking, cleaning, getting myself to swim meets or whatnot. And so I think many of you might identify with that and the responsibilities that come with that and what that means as a kid. I also had, Mayra and I have talked about this. My dad was in prison for a while. And so I say that in that I think the experiences of kids across the country are diverse. I think we recognize and we know so much more about that now than we did, say, when I was a kid. And we can reflect the needs of behavioral and mental health care, the needs to talk about these things and normalize them so that kids aren't taking this all on their own. And I will say, I shared this with Mayra, that I had a personal experience where I was working at a settlement and I was talking to the state's doctor, what's the title? It's not solicitor, it's Surgeon General, the state Surgeon General. And we were talking about opioids and the need and the importance of the ACEs and how they impact our community and how they impact kids. And I will be honest, it was the first time I'd ever heard of ACEs. It was the first time and I was like, oh, and she kept talking about like, oh, if you might have violence in your home, or you might have a parent who was in the prison system, or an alcoholic or person with something. And I just kept thinking, oh, that's me. That's me. That's me. And to have that experience right in my 30s while I was fighting for healthcare, but also not understanding like, oh, all of these experiences I had as a kid, they shaped who I am, certainly in a positive way. And I'm lucky that I had such a strong mom and a strong sister, but also like they impacted me and they impacted my mental health and they impacted how I access higher education or high school or services. And so I think for me, thinking about that sort of comprehensive look of how we raise kids, how our kids in our community, and thinking about all of the experiences and that diverse experience, and really thinking about the intersectionality of those experiences, I think is really important. And I think that's where like our office comes in, right? So we run a national civil rights office, um, which, I think in of itself, people think, oh, civil rights, right? Like, oh, I have rights, I have protections. And those civil rights can be based on your age, your race, your disability, a nationality standard, sex-based discrimination, sexual orientation, gender identities, pregnancy-related conditions, and thinking through like, what does it mean to be a kid or a parent who maybe doesn't speak English, maybe doesn't, maybe has a disability, and like the intersectionality of those and how you access the community and how you access services, I think is really important. And I think, you might share this, but like for me, like when I go to the doctor with family members, I'm a lawyer and I work in healthcare. And so I would say my theas and theos, like they say, like I'm a loudmouth, right? I'm a loudmouth at the hospital asking all the questions because culturally in my family, we don't do that. Right. And so I think it's the intersectionality of who we are as people and the rights that we have, but also making sure we're culturally accessible, culturally accommodating to that, because it's not uniform. We're not a monolith, right? And so that's the diversity in our communities, and that's the diversity in our populations, and recognizing that, and that recognizing that intersectionality, I think is really important to kids, right? Understanding that it is access to healthcare, it is access to mental and behavioral health services, but also it's making sure that when I go to the doctor with my mom, I'm not on the hook to translate things for her and putting me under that pressure, that there is translation services, or if there's a disability, making sure that there's effective communication for that person. And so it's really the intersectionality of that, I think, really helps contribute to a children's ability to thrive, and making sure that we at HHS are thinking about that across all of our programs and services, I think is really important. So that was a long-winded way to say something I probably could have said shorter.
No, I love that. And I think it relates a lot to the work we do at our organization alongside a number of different partners, thinking about the strength of intersectional advocacy in particular, a belief that, families lead these multi-issue lives. Like it's the Audre Lorde quote, right? There is no thing as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. This whole child, whole family approach, which is exactly what you're talking about, it's necessary to support child health and well-being. And I want to touch on something you said about these external factors that are impacting child health and well-being that often come out in like an ACEs screening, right? We're fortunate in California to have a dedicated effort to have ACEs screening in our healthcare settings that help identify all of the many factors that impact child's well-being. Equitable access to healthy food, affordable housing, clean air, and access to parks. I mean, reliable internet access, all of the above. And I think to your point about the work of the Office for Civil Rights, I think it's an incredible example of an agency that recognizes how connected those challenges are. And I'm curious, can you speak to that, the fact that there's these issues, privacy or language access, that at face value may not be a children's issue, but when you dig deeper, it actually has a lot to do with the well-being of our kids. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I will give one example. So, our office does non-discrimination in health programs and activities. That's a lawyer's way of saying you can't be discriminated against, right? You need to be able to access health and human services free from discrimination. When you unpack that, how you interact across the healthcare system, one area that's coming up a lot right now is artificial intelligence. And,
Mm.
it's all over. I try to remind folks the law hasn't changed. The law is still the law. You can't discriminate no matter what kinds of platforms or technologies you're using. But I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about how artificial intelligence could be really helpful for finding sepsis in kids. And that they wanted this sort of needle in the haystack approach, but they were using evidence they had from their patients. And the more they dug into that evidence, the more that they saw differentials between Latino kids and non-Latino kids, white kids. And through that, they initially had thought, oh, like Latino kids are healthier, or that in some way they weren't getting sepsis in the same amount of time it took for these other kids. But when they started to unpack it, they realized that it wasn't that at all. It was that for a lot of these Latino families and kids, there was a language access barrier. And so that meant they got diagnostic tests and treatment later than other kids. And I think you could probably find examples like that beyond in the healthcare system, right? Where we know the intersectionality of these things and how someone enters into a clinic or a hospital or a pharmacy varies. And so, whether you think like privacy is a kid's issue or not, it certainly is, right? And thinking about, um, if I'm a parent and I want my kids' medical records, HIPAA, a cornerstone of HIPAA is that you have access to your own records. And if you're, your caregiver or a parent, you can be the medical representative for a minor or an adult parent and access those records. Now, if you're trying to access those records at like a clinic, a lot of clinics don't follow this provision well. And so they might give you the runaround. They might try to overcharge you for the records. They might delay when you get the records. And so that would be one example where just having the knowledge of what your rights are can be powerful and certainly empower parents and kids. So that's just one way. One of the other areas we talk a lot about in this space, right, is you talked a little bit about this in your opening remarks. I think we're in a moment right now where there are a lot of banned aspects to healthcare happening across the country. And, you can have that range, whether it's for a trans healthcare ban, or it's for a reproductive healthcare ban, or it's banning, those who don't speak English from a certain aspect. I think we're seeing those pop up around the country. And, like whether or not those laws pass or they survive legal challenges, it in those communities, it creates fear, right? And it creates an environment where people don't know what they can and can't do. And so I would just flag, even in California, I was recently in the Inland Empire. I did some roundtables there and I was in community, and I specifically reached out and meet with Latino communities in a lot of places I go to try to understand how we can be more helpful. I did a lot with Black communities. I did a lot with AAPI communities because we're trying to make sure we're inclusive in our work. In the Inland Empire, in California, they were telling me people are still scared to go to the emergency room. People are still scared to access children's health insurance because of the previous administration's public charge rule. And so again, that's the nexus between this public charge rule, which has civil rights implications, what your current rights are, and understanding that, this sort of chill effect. And so I think we see that a lot across the country, both with things like public charge, things like, gender affirming care bans, things like reproductive health care bans. We're seeing that across the country where it's just providing a chill effect. And I think, my office is here, we're small, but I also to try to educate consumers, advocates, patient groups, and others on the ground so that folks understand even in these situations where these laws are passing, you continue to have federal civil rights, you continue to have federal privacy rights. And that if something goes wrong or something you feel like maybe wasn't right, you could work with an organization and file a complaint, or you could reach out to the office and have a conversation with us about whether or not that was legal in the first instance. And so I just think it's an important tool because I think, the ability to just go to a healthcare center or a human services center and not have to worry that it's going to be accessible in your language, it's going to be accessible to you as a person with disability. you're going to be treated appropriately, you're not going to be discriminated against, I think is a privilege. And I think a lot of our communities don't have that privilege. And especially, working parents who might be representative of various communities across the country. And so I really to me, it's really important to be on the ground in community and to be on platforms like this, educating folks so that folks can empower themselves and empower their communities. Because I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think, even under this administration, when we have these state laws happening, there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of people who benefit from that misinformation. And so how can we arm parents and families and kids with information so that they feel empowered to go to the doctor, they feel empowered to stick up for their kid or to stick up or to work with the provider to get the care that they need?
There is so much there of what you just talked about, that I can take it in so many different directions. But yeah, I really appreciated what you're talking about as far as equipping our community members, our families, our parents with information. Information is power, right? And oftentimes there is so much misinformation. I mean, people are having information thrown at them from so many different directions with social media and all the ways we get information to families these days. And it's actually alive and well across the country, and in particular here in California, as we're thinking about the unwinding of Medicaid and the protections during the public health emergency. I know you know this effort well, Director Fontes Rainer, and one of the things that I want to emphasize at the Children's Partnership in our work is we really try to ensure that public programs, the programs and systems that are intended to serve children and families, actually work for them. And I see that as fundamental to the Office for Civil Rights' work, right? These are programs that are intended to serve people and should work for people, right? And you're trying to hold people accountable or programs accountable to that. But we know that too often these programs are inaccessible to the very people that they're intended for. And that could be anything from administrative hurdles like paperwork, to your point, language barriers, or frankly, like the unwelcoming environment of a county office. I mean, listening session after listening session has told us that community members feel undignified, that they don't feel like they're seen as humans, as community members. And right now we're in this middle of this effort to make sure millions of people across the country are staying enrolled in Medicaid or Medi-Cal here in California. But since we started the unwinding, 1.2 million Californians have lost coverage, including, some 284,000 children. And that's with a department who is trying really hard. That's with counties that we know are doing their best and are short-staffed. But there are, again, a lot of sources of misinformation and confusion. And frankly, people have really busy lives, right? Oftentimes we don't think about health insurance until we need it. So there's a lot of factors at play here. But oftentimes it's the very programs that aren't working for people. Can you talk a little bit about like lessons that you've seen since the unwinding started, that can inform what we all are doing collectively in order to keep kids covered?
Yeah, so I think that's really helpful frame. And I will say, in addition to all the things that you said, we at HHS for the first time have a secretary who is Mexican American. That's not insignificant, right? And I go around the country and I try to be in a community as much as I can because I think that's where I should be and that's where I learn what I need to do and how to help people. But it is really significant, I think, to have an administration and have an HHS that looks like the rest of the country, whether it's the secretary or myself or others that represent the diversity both through gender and race and nationality. But I also think, so we have done, I'll be careful, but we have an open investigation with a number of states across the country. I won't get into specifics of states, but we have seen, like what you're saying, right? There's states that are trying to help people. There's states that are trying to help people and missing the mark terribly. And then I think there's a lot of states that maybe don't necessarily even know how they're getting it wrong. I don't try to impute bad faith. I think, generally speaking, most of these actors are really trying to re-enroll people and to help there be seamless access to coverage. Obviously, a lot of these agencies have budgetary issues, and they're not fully staffed in the way that they should be in the first instance, let alone to do this massive effort to do redeterminations of eligibility for coverage. We know from some of the complaints we've seen and some of the listening sessions we've seen, websites haven't been translated into the appropriate number of languages. We've heard a lot of issues, as I'm sure a lot of folks on this this Zoom have heard, call center issues, right? Where if you're calling and you're asking questions in English, you're getting through a line much faster than you're having to, whether you're waiting for Spanish or an AAPI language, and forget about the fact that oftentimes states aren't translating into Indigenous languages or other languages that might be reflective of the population, but are harder to translate for and harder to provide services for. And so we have experience in this during COVID-19. The National Health Lawyers Program filed a complaint with our office, Department of Homeland Security, and FEMA. And that complaint was against 19 states. And those 19 states, it was through their public health departments where NHELP said, hey, your masking policies, your vaccine policies, they're in violation of federal civil rights laws, both for language access under Title VI, as well as effective communication under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability. And through that process, we did an investigation. We looked at policies, we looked at their websites, we did secret shopping on their call centers. We talked with people on the ground. And through that, we were able to get all 19 of those states to update their policies, to update their websites, to update their masking policies, vaccine policies, so that they were compliant with respect to language access, as well as translating services and effective communication. And we did a bunch of webinars for them. We worked really closely with these states. I think my staff said something in the order of like 10,000 agencies were represented in a lot of these efforts. So it was a pretty widespread effort. It was with us and the Department of Homeland Security as well as FEMA. So we have experience, and we know states know how to work with us to be compliant, because, I think for a lot of places, and this isn't just the government, right? Like there are other entities that are covered under federal civil rights laws, that are covered under HIPAA, who are lax in their duties under those laws. And then that's not, again, to impute bad faith. It's just language access is required. And it shouldn't be an afterthought. It shouldn't be something you're just doing when HHS notices you're not doing it well. It should be built into the muscle memory of the organization and the process, period. And even within the healthcare system, we see a lot of hospitals and others not prioritizing this in the right way. I mean, an example I like to use with folks is that my office did an investigation of Maricopa County. That is the largest, it's actually the county I'm in today. It's the largest county in Arizona. It's a very large Spanish-speaking population. And based off of a complaint and investigation we did, we determined that the superior court system there was not translating things into Spanish. I use that example because I think people think we've gotten Spanish down pat, like we're good to go there. And I think it's just a reflector to say, in a large community where there are Spanish-speaking services needed, what was required and what was needed wasn't being done. And again, they're now compliant. We're monitoring them. We're working with them to be compliant. But I think that's just like the canary in the coal mine to say this continues to be a pretty big issue across the country. And not even getting to like cultural accessibility, right? That like it would be really helpful to have eligibility people who speak various languages, but also who understand cultural norms and cultural accessibility in a lot of these places. It would be really helpful, in addition to like auxiliary aids or having a companion present for a person with disability, to also be reflective of that as the person engages with the healthcare system. And so a lot of these things, we've put out best practices. We've talked a lot in the space. We know the mark is being missed. And I've been in community where I was just in North Carolina recently. And in North Carolina, I was in a room where it was basically a group of organizations all across the state that worked together to provide language access services during COVID-19 and elsewhere. And in real time in this meeting, they were learning from one another about how to share resources, the National Registry on Language Access, for example, and, National Registry of Certified translators, so that if I don't, my organization doesn't have a translator of a particular language, I can utilize one of these other websites or services to quickly provide such services. And just overall, I think the area is something that needs a lot of attention. I think it needs more investment and resources. I'm technically not allowed to say that, but I also just think it's something we need to invest more overall, our knowledge of, our resources on. It's something that we've prioritized at the department. Now every part of HHS will have a language access plan. Every part of HHS will have a plan up on their website by May. The department has a new plan. It's something that is a priority here, but it's also something that, like, if you can't communicate with an eligibility person, and these are real cases. I heard of a parent and a parent on behalf of the kid trying to apply the kid into CHIP. And the eligibility worker told the parent, you're not eligible because you're not a citizen, right? So mixed status family. And we know that, right? We all know the answer to that question is that's not right. But I think to your earlier point, Mayra, like, we see these cases where they're not even following what the law is necessarily. It might be imputing a judgment call based on what's happening around them in the local community. And it means that that kid's not going to, I mean, this kid did because they came with our office and we're helping them. But like in many of those cases, that person that make it to a civil rights office or a local advocacy or legal aid organization, they might end up without coverage, which is a bigger problem. And so it's a communal effort and it's something we all have to keep working on and we need to do better on.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And this speaks to something that you were talking about earlier around just like the remaining work to rebuild trust with community, right? This idea that these government programs are supposed to work for people. It's almost like laughable. It's people don't believe that. Like they're so accustomed to these programs not working. Add on top of that an environment that caused fear, a rhetoric that demeaned whole populations, particularly the immigrant community under the last federal administration. We're playing catch up, right? Even with all of the incredible movement in this administration and in those last few years, it's been challenging. And I want to pause or talk about that a little bit because that has real implications on mental health, the stress of not having coverage, the worry that your child is sick and you can't have them taken care of, whether it's because of language barrier or questions about how expensive it's going to be, or frankly, lack of transportation to get you there. The mental stress of that leads to real health implications, not only for children, but for their caregivers and parents alike. And it relates back to these social drivers of health that, we joke around sometimes, like in my own circles, like if we want the best mental health intervention is a stable job almost, right? Or stable housing. These ideas of how intersectional they are, particularly for our children as we're trying to raise them in thriving environments. So I'm curious, in the work of the Office for Civil Rights, how does mental health play out? Because that's like a through line on so many of these issues. And I would love to hear a bit, given the crisis that we've been facing as a country, of course, exacerbated by COVID-19. But even before that, there was a mental health crisis, particularly among young people.
Yeah, so I will just like to start like the technician part of this, right? So one, we at the Office of Rights during COVID and after COVID did a lot of work to make sure people understand what their privacy rights are and accessibility of information. We actually just finalized a rule in January of this year that's aimed at substance use disorders, for example, because we know in substance use disorder providers that the underlying law restricted how those records might be coordinated amongst providers and how those records might be used in a discriminatory way. And so now we have a new rule that allows for the same protections that apply to HIPAA to apply to records tied to substance use disorders, which also allows SAMHSA to do civil penalties if it's violated. There's now a complaint portal. There will be one consent sign. So things that make it easier to get the care in the first instance. And I know you talked about mental behavioral health, but I think certainly substance disorder is a big part of that. We're in the midst of an opioid crisis, right? We know that for many families, like someone, or you have someone in your family, or you have a friend who has suffered an opioid use disorder, or even overdosed or passed away. It's very common, right? And I think also thinking through in our office, we've done a lot of work in the child welfare space because I will say personally, I had my father pass away from an opioid use disorder. And he had an opioid overdose death. And so we know there's a lot of stigma for kids and families when they have these, maybe a family member, a parent who might have a substance use disorder, and that might like stream its way into how people are accessing foster youth programs and other programs and services. And so we specifically work with SAMHSA, the Administration for Children and Families, to put out myth versus fact when it comes to child welfare services and, for example, placement into foster youth programs, and whether or not persons with disabilities, including persons with substance use disorders, might be available to be in a as a foster parent. Removal of kids from homes with parents with substance use disorders. And so just reminding folks, right? Like if you have a substance use disorder and you're in active recovery and treatment, you are protected under both the Americans with Disability Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And we've also know, for example, in the child welfare space, look, I get it. A lot of these organizations, especially in the human services, they're underfunded, they're short-staffed. Civil rights and privacy might not be at the top of their list of things that they have to prioritize on any given day. And so we've tried to work with a number of state agencies. We recently did a settlement with the state of Pennsylvania and their human services, specifically in child welfare space, to make sure that they're training eligibility and benefit specialists, that they're working to incorporate these practices into their websites and materials so that there's not inadvertent discrimination, which might further many of these disparities. And so that's just one example, right? But also understanding things like Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, which I know you're very familiar with your time in the administration and the Affordable Care Act, is non-discrimination in health programs and activities. The previous administration changed the rule quite a bit. And so current status is that it's more the jurisdiction my office has to do enforcement is more limited right now than it might otherwise be. We're in the process of updating this rule. So for example, insurance is one area in which we're limited right now. But that rule also protects, all the things we've been talking about and that I think contribute to better mental health, behavioral health. So whether it's my ability to have mental and behavioral health services in a language that's my language, whether or not I'm able to have a culturally accessible mental and behavioral health services, right? And we know that SAMHSA has done a lot of work in this space, and we've tried to work really closely with them to make sure that there's this intersectionality of these health equity issues, and also making sure that we're building this into all parts of the department, making sure that providers and clinicians have the training, whether it's effective communication under disability or language access services. HRSA put out, grants last year to train primary care physicians and other behavioral health specialists in this space. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in this space. It's a continual effort. It's certainly a priority effort, but I also think it's just recognizing in some cultures, right, getting access to mental behavioral health services, even having the ability to say that or to have that conversation is difficult. It shouldn't be made more difficult by other barriers, whether it's language, it's like getting somewhere, availability of services, making sure that once you're there, you have a positive experience, so you want to go back, right? Understanding co-pays and co-insurance and things like your prescriptions, all the things that are interconnected in how you experience the healthcare system, making sure that you're able to do that in a way that you feel comfortable and you don't feel like you're being stigmatized or treated differently because of who you are.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, this idea of where our own experiences and culture play out as far as access to services, where our community members get clarity around information or help to navigate these systems. Oftentimes that support rests in the community itself, like community members, promotoras, community health workers, community health representatives. They go by a number of different names, but oftentimes it is centered in the incredible wisdom and experience that community members bring to this work. a lot of our advocacy is centered in uplifting that leadership of our community members. The idea that, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And I have heard and we have read, the Health and Human Services at the national level, I think has really worked in this administration to strengthen its community engagement efforts, really focusing on how to make sure people are getting the information they need and that information is protected in order to ensure that they're able to make these best decisions. I think your opening comments, you talked about empowering people with the information they need to make the best decisions. I love that. Can you talk to us a little bit about the role of OCR in its commitment to community engagement? Because when you talk about these issues, they're pretty complex, right? Filing a complaint, oftentimes poor people, we don't have lawyers, right? It's like it's one of the most difficult things to have, and yet it's fundamental to ensuring that we have when we are protecting our rights. Can you talk a little bit about your community engagement efforts and how that's strengthening your work?
Yeah, so my rule of thumb is always, would my mom, who's 75, and or she lives with me now, but she used to live in Phoenix, or one of my aunts, who are also in their 60s and 70s, if something happened to them, they live in Phoenix, would they be able to make it to my website? And oftentimes the answer to that question is probably not. I mean, probably yes, because I'm
Yeah.
their niece and daughter, but probably not. And I think you're right. It takes a very sophisticated consumer to make it to my website or with the help of an organization. So it's been really important to us, both with the previous administration. I think they were focused in a lot of areas that weren't necessarily in community. And so there was not a lot of engagement. And then COVID-19 happened, right? Which just certainly, I think, halted all of community engagement pretty seriously. And so, since I've been at OCR, we've done a couple of things. So one, I've traveled to every single one of our regions. We are a national office. We have offices in 11 cities across the country. So I've been to all of those offices at least one time. We've also done a lot of travel in a number of other states. Like today I'm in Arizona. I was in Nashville last week. I was in Durham, North Carolina last week. I'm going to be, going to Texas in a couple of weeks. And so I would say to folks, one, every region across the country, no matter where you live, if it's in California, it's my Pacific region, but if it's elsewhere, you have representation at a regional level. If you think it might be helpful to have OCR on a community meeting or at an event, or even just, sometimes they'll just talk to smaller providers that don't understand HIPAA, and we'll do a session with them. We will do that. And we have the ability to do that. And that's important to us. We've also tried to, we have a bunch of rules coming out this month and next month. And so we're trying to do a lot of how can we utilize things like Zoom to get to more people. So
Yeah.
we released a privacy rule yesterday that supports reproductive healthcare privacy. In a couple of days, we'll do a webinar where we'll do my regional office in every region. We'll do a webinar alongside a subject matter expert, and they'll talk about the rule. Because we again, what good is the rule if people don't understand how to use it? We try to do a lot of national leading events too. And then there's just, if you look, yes, filing a complaint, I think, can be intimidating to folks. What I like to tell folks is you can file a complaint on the back of a napkin, right? It doesn't have to be a legal brief, doesn't have to be super sophisticated. And in many instances, even if it doesn't end up being a violation where we issue a notice of violation, just having an investigator from the Office for Civil Rights call and start to ask questions oftentimes is enough for the provider or the dentist or whoever to correct the problem that was happening in the first instance. And so I think thinking about how do we work with Children's Partnership or other partners on this call to get that information to the community to make their way. Our website is hhs.gov/OCR. And on that page, you'll find information on HIPAA, civil rights, how to file a complaint. And I think, if folks here think, I'm not sure if this should be a complaint, you can reach out to me. My email is just melanie.rainer@hhs.gov, and we'll send information around to Children's Partnerships so they can send some of that information around. But look, you can file a complaint. You can also have a conversation with us. And I think just making sure folks understand that we're trusted. I will give an example just to show folks. So we also have jurisdiction under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is race discrimination.
Mm.
And last year, we entered into a settlement with the state of Alabama. The state of Alabama Public Health Department, because in a county there in Lowndes County, which is about 80% African American, there was no wastewater disposal sanitation systems for homes or schools or churches. So what that meant is a lot of the people in the community there have raw sewage in their yards, in their homes. They take to a practice called straight piping, where they create their own systems and then it just pipes out into the back of their house. Right. And the product of that is that there's a lot of respiratory illness. There's things like hookworm. Kids in this community can't play outside. And sometimes when they're outside, they have to wear masks because that's just, the air is bad. So we had a complaint filed by an organization, a national organization filed it. We were able to investigate, talk to witnesses, put a lot of information together, and we presented it to the state and said, hey, we think there's a problem here and we think you can do more. This was a positive interaction where the state came to the table and said, yes, we will work with you. And now they're working on a public health plan, infrastructure plan. In addition to the fact that the state, before this agreement went into place, would put liens on people's properties for not having sanitation systems in their home. So think about that. The state and county weren't providing the systems in the first instance or the infrastructure, but they were back on the back end penalizing largely a Black community for not having such systems in place. And people were suffering both financial issues due to these liens or the damages to their home and public health issues. So we were able to use our authority and come to a settlement with the state. I raise this as an example because this is a predominantly Black community in Alabama. When I was on the ground there, when my staff's been on the ground, we work a lot with churches there. We work a lot with local leaders. And the message to us has been, don't reinvent the organization, the community organization structure here. We have that. Use us, work through us, but also don't be one and done. Don't just come here one time and never come back. You have to be here every day, or not every day, but you have to be here very regularly to make sure this thing is going to work and to get the trust of the community. And so, both myself and the Department of Justice, we have staff that pretty regularly are going to Alabama. I don't have an office in Alabama, but I'm sending staff to Alabama almost every month. And that's because, to your earlier point, we have to recharge this trust in the federal government and recharge, especially in communities where maybe there isn't a trust with the local government. Right. And so it's been really important to me and my staff to be on the ground in Alabama, to be at these communities. I mean, I've gone to meetings in churches there, very small churches, but it's really important to them to have a physical face presence there by the federal government. And so obviously we can't do that everywhere, but we're trying to as much as we can. And to the extent folks think someone on the ground here or a community meeting might be helpful, if we can do it, we'll do it. And I think it's really important to just get that message out to folks because, to our earlier conversation, right? There's a lot of stuff happening right now that I think people are really worried and scared. And we want to make sure people understand we're a trusted partner. And if you talk to us, we're going to respect you and give you, help you navigate the situation in a trusted way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I have to say, thank you for the work that you all are doing. I want to give a shout out to our legal aid partners in the state of California and across the country. The Health Consumer Alliance is right there with us, as is NHELP and Western Center on Law and Poverty. This advocacy, this fight to protect the health and well-being of our kids, it's stronger when we align ourselves with partners, and that's clearly what you're doing by leveraging the strength and leadership of those communities. So thank you for that work that you're doing. It's sometimes hard to believe, honestly, right, in our country today that these things are happening, and they are. It's the reality that these systems have created. And we're getting close to time, so I want to be mindful that there are a couple questions that came in, Director Fontes Rainer, about income, actually, and then access to services, particularly for immigrant communities. So I have a closing question for you, but let's jump into that. One question is, and this is such an important question, particularly for a state like California, where our cost of living is quite expensive, but that's happening, in many places across the country. We know people are losing coverage, health insurance coverage, access to food, access to other important benefits because they make too much money. But if you really think about it, it's not too much money when you're thinking about how expensive it is to live in our communities, particularly our urban areas, but frankly, everywhere in the state of California. So can you talk a little bit about what the department is doing to advocate for potentially changing the federal poverty level, or what's on the horizon for what that might look like as far as eligibility and access to programs?
Yeah, so I think it's certainly a good flag, and I know when we try to do press releases or we talk about people say FPL, right? Federal Poverty Limit, which is like DC speak for an acronym that just how much you make. And I know there's been an effort really to be transparent in that and not just put percentages, but also the actual dollar numbers, because to your point, right, in many communities, it isn't a livable wage. And in many communities, it hasn't kept up with the rate of inflation of housing, the rate of inflation, or rather lack of inflation to wages or the minimum wage. So I think overall, there's an effort, within the Biden-Harris administration to think more about how to put more dollars in people's pockets and to empower families financially. There's been a lot of work, for example, with like medical billing and debt, right? And the Biden administration announced a bunch of actions where they were canceling certain debt practices. The
Mm.
No Surprises Act empowers consumers, if they don't have insurance, to have a limitation and have a transparent structure for how they receive billing information. Meaning that if you get a bill that's over, I think it's like in excess of $500 of what you thought, that then you're able to work and go through a negotiation process and get a lower amount. Or that if you think you've gotten a surprise bill and you shouldn't have, you're able to work and file a complaint and have that resolved at a lower amount. I think these are all collective efforts. And certainly there are other efforts, specific to FPL, and thinking about how to change those. Some of those require statutory changes, and some of them don't. But I think overall, bringing healthcare to the communities and thinking about what does it mean in community is really important. And drawing having real people stories at the table, making sure we're talking about these things so that it's not just 300% of FPL. It's a working mom of two in San Mateo who makes $45,000, right? And thinking through that. And I will just say, through my other hat that I used to wear when I worked in the AG's office, and probably a lot of your legal aid partners know this, right? But in California, yes, there's things called like charity care where you can get healthcare help when you're at a hospital if you're under a certain income level. What people don't often realize is that in California, many hospitals also have reduced
Mhm.
payment options for people under certain federal poverty limits, as high as like 350% or 200% of federal poverty. They're underutilized, and I think oftentimes the hospitals don't make people aware of these policies, but they are there and they can be helpful to communities. And so I think that's something I would encourage folks to reach out to some of the organizations like the legal aid organizations, Southern Poverty Law, that's not what you said, Southwestern Poverty Law Center, and some other organizations like the Attorney General's office, because there are structures there, they're just not utilized enough. And I
Mm.
think oftentimes the hospitals don't do enough to make communities aware of these things in the first instance. I know when we were at the AG's office, we really focused on this quite a bit, to the point of even secret shopping, to think about how do we make people aware of this, and how do we get the hospitals to do more in this? And I think the other way to think about it too is when the AG's office approves mergers, acquisitions, like when the hospitals join up with other practices, they oftentimes impose conditions on those hospitals. These are public. Now, I don't expect everyone on here to go look them up, but they are public. They do impose
Yeah.
conditions, and oftentimes they will set like, you have to do this much dollars in reduced or free help or charity care. And I think again, working to draw more transparency and make those available to folks. But that's exclusive to California. Obviously, most hospitals under the IRS have charity care policies, but I often think they're underutilized, and there's ways to try to draw more scrutiny on those and make them more accessible for community.
Absolutely. And that is definitely an effort, led by Health Access in our state, really thinking through about just the community benefit responsibilities of hospitals, right? Absolutely. Okay, so I want to be mindful of time. And as we wrap up, I want to invite you, Director Fontes Rainer, to help us end this dialogue with some closing words, and ask you something that we ask each of our participants in this series. For those of you that we were not able to answer your questions because of of the particular case, we're going to follow up and make sure we get you the information you need. So don't worry about that for the questions that did come through. But for you, Director, as we consider what together we want to do in this virtual space, online, and in the broader community for our children's future, what advice can you give advocates for being as effective as possible in messaging or action, especially when it comes to working with like an office like yours?
Yeah, so first I want to say to all the advocates and organizations, thank you. I know you're tired, and I know you bear a tremendous amount of responsibility to be a voice or to be the participant for lots of communities and stakeholders across the country. And so I want to recognize that I see you, and I thank you for that. I know it's an incredible amount of burden. Burden, it makes it negative, but we ask a lot of our advocates, right? That's the truth. And two, I think it's really important to share patient perspectives and stories because, I was just at an event today on this reproductive healthcare privacy rule, where a provider talked about what it means to provide abortion care in a state like Arizona. And I think those patient perspectives are really important. And as they tied an Office for Civil Rights, I will like just casually hear in a conversation this X thing happened to a person, and the person will just be telling me, like, as a matter of fact, not in I'm asking you to file a complaint or I'm asking you to do something. And I'll say, wait a minute, what happened to you, right? And try to really drill into it. And if I if we can then follow up and get the person to help connect us to the patient or to the organization, we can do something. And I will say, a lot of people don't fully know their rights, and so sharing those stories, having connectivity with the federal government, whether it's my office or it's another office, is really important because this administration, my office, like, we want to help people, and if we can do something, we will. Um, and so I think just thinking about how else we can be helpful. We'll have a bunch of rules coming out this month with fact sheets and toolkits and videos in various languages, making sure that you have those so that you're armed with this power and information, and then making sure folks understand how to reach out to us or how to file a complaint, I think are the most important things, in addition to like the patient and provider perspective that we're seeing across the country.
Absolutely. Well, Director, I'm incredibly grateful for this conversation and for the wealth of information that you shared with us, and most important, for the incredible leadership that you're bringing, not only to the Office for Civil Rights, but to the department as a whole, and to steering our nation in the direction that we want it to go. We have this saying in California, as you know, as California goes, so goes the nation. So hopefully that's the trend as we try to make California the best state to have, raise, and be a child. So really appreciate you being with us. And thank you to
Thank you.
everybody. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you everyone for being with us. And again, huge thanks to our event sponsors and partners. And a special thank you again to the wonderful team at the Children's Partnership for making this discussion possible. Have a great rest of your day.